and I'm delighted to introduce Layla Lavallee. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Layla is a midwife, and it's always fantastic to have midwives as a part of the research team and presenting papers, because they are the members of staff who have the most contact with our women, and therefore not only have to deliver the service, but also have the understanding of how the women receive and accept the service. So I'm handing over to Layla, who's going to talk to us about the postnatal experience. Layla, it's all yours.
Thank you. Right, I shall share my screen here. Great, can you see that? Is that in presenter mode or?
Yes, that's great, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. So I'm doing a PhD. I'm in my final year, and I'm going to be presenting the findings of my study. Just to say, it's a work in progress, and so I'd actually really appreciate any sort of feedback or insights people have. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm going to gloss over, I think, some of the things that I think this particular audience are quite familiar with, and I'm going to hone in more on, I think, the findings that are challenging sort of current approaches to care. So, oh, hang on, sorry, this isn't.
Sorry, Layla, I think you've got the PDF up rather than the PowerPoint.
Oh, no. Okay. Sorry. 1 second. Let me. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. How's that? There.
So that's now the PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay.
And that's in presenter. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yes. So, as you all know, mothers and babies who have been affected by hypertensive disorders in pregnancy are significantly more likely to have cardiovascular disease in the future. And these risks affect some more than others. Now, there are things that women can do in the postnatal period to reduce these future cardiovascular risks. However, most of these strategies place the bulk of responsibility on individual women to manage or control their behaviors at a time when they've got quite a lot going on, particularly if they've got other things going on in their lives. So if we want these strategies to work, and to work for the people who need them the most, especially, then we need a better understanding than we currently have as to what these women's lives are like in the postnatal period. And so that essentially was the purpose of my study. So I did a qualitative study, and I interviewed 20 women from different parts of England, from a range of ethnicities, and the majority of whom were experiencing sort of complex social factors. And basically, I wanted to find out what was life like for them in the postnatal period, what was important to them, what were their priorities, and what factors could impact their ability to engage in this postnatal cardiovascular health promotion. Now, in terms of what life was like in the postnatal period, recovery was very prolonged, but it wasn't just the physical recovery. All of the women that I interviewed, apart from one, had significant mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, stemming from having preeclampsia itself, but also just the conditions of their lives and sort of what was going on. A lot had felt very isolated, didn't have a lot of support networks, and there was considerable intersecting adversity. So poverty, uncertain immigration status, domestic abuse, etc. And as this one participant says, I just survive each day, basically. You just get from one day to the next and wonder what the next thing will be. And a lot of them were falling through the gaps significantly as well. I interviewed a woman whose baby had died, and obviously she still has the same postnatal needs physically in terms of long-term cardiovascular risks, but had absolutely no follow-up because of the circumstances. And then I interviewed several women who were in the asylum seeking system as well, and they were especially vulnerable. So just to give you an example, there was one woman who, she was 31 weeks when she had to have an emergency cesarean for severe preeclampsia. Baby went to special care. She was homeless at the time. Her immigration visa had expired, and she was discharged by social services to a hotel with £50, nobody to look after her. She had an eclamptic fit, was luckily found by the housekeeping staff who called an ambulance, ended up in intensive care for several days, spent a month in hospital, was paralyzed down one side. She was finally discharged with the baby after a month into more suitable accommodation because one of the doctors specifically intervened and sort of made sure that that happened. And that was just kind of one example of many of really kind of extreme circumstances these women were facing. Now, in terms of what the participants wanted in my study, they wanted, first of all, to be with their babies. That was their number one priority. It overtook everything. And if that was threatened in any way, they would put their own safety and well-being at risk just to be with their babies. So one woman who had an eclamptic fit after was resisting being readmitted to hospital because they didn't want to let her bring the baby in. And they really wanted better mental health support. That was a key priority, but meaningful, not just being given antidepressants and tailored to their specific needs. And also several of the women talked about, they didn't just want counseling, they wanted help to deal with the factors that were causing their mental health to be so challenging. So like this woman said, I need practical help, not sitting around having a cup of tea and chatting to someone. And goes without saying, they wanted kind, empathetic, non-judgmental care, which unfortunately wasn't always what they experienced. Ongoing specialist support. They wanted to breastfeed as well. A lot of these women specifically wanted help, but it felt like because they'd had preeclampsia, the attitude of the staff seemed to be more, it's going to be too difficult, and they were kind of discouraged from it, which is relevant given, we've got this evidence showing that breastfeeding is linked to improved cardiovascular outcomes for mothers and babies. That's kind of one of the key things you can do for the babies in that circumstance. Now, they also, and this is where it gets a little bit more controversial, they didn't want weight loss advice. This was something that I explored, first came up in my PPI work and also my literature review. And it was something I explored in the interviews. And basically the women were saying they know they're overweight, they know weight is a problem, they've tried to lose weight, and it makes them feel worse about themselves. And also by this point, a lot of them had experienced considerable stigma within the healthcare system regarding their weight. And it was just felt like one more kind of example of this instance of it. It felt like blame, and it felt discriminatory and biased. So one of the women pointed out that, she felt that the ideals around kind of ideal body weight were based on sort of white norms. And she was saying, as a Black woman, that just isn't realistic for her. And another woman was saying, she said she felt like the emphasis on weight loss all the time, it didn't accept the fact that people come in different shapes and sizes. And she felt it was almost like we're trying to eradicate larger people from society. And also highlighted the fact that the effort it required to lose weight really negatively impacted other aspects of their lives. And, and the impact that had on them, it didn't feel like it was worth the trade-off. And also one woman pointed out that it doesn't work. She said 95% of the times diets are not effective in the long term. Would they recommend a medication that is proven to not be effective 95% of the times, but causes significant side effects? Another one highlighted that it can put healthcare professionals in an uncomfortable situation, and sort of noted that it's hypocritical to be told to lose weight by somebody who themselves could do with losing weight. They also highlighted that BMI is a flawed measure. So a few of the women talked about how, although they were overweight now, when they had been thinner, they weren't healthy, they were starving themselves. And yet this one woman was saying she'd go to the GP and she'd be sort of congratulated on her size, but she was saying actually she's much healthier now and feels much better, even though she's a larger weight. And basically they just had other priorities, and it just felt insensitive, essentially. And so in terms of alternative, the suggestions that women had were just take the emphasis on weight out of the equation, just focus instead on eating healthy and getting opportunities for enjoyable exercise. And one of the women talked about sort of an example of how it was managed, she thought, in a sensitive way. She said, there was a consultant who I really liked. I felt he saw me as a person and not just the BMI. He didn't take the choices away from me. There was that respect there. you know, not just that top down, well, I'm the professional and I know what I'm talking about, so you just need to do what I'm telling you. Now, having said that, although women talked about taking the emphasis off weight, a couple of them asked about and talked about weight loss drugs as well, the potential for that, and whether it would be safe to take those if they were to get pregnant again or if they were breastfeeding. And also the other aspect was the affordability of it, the cost. They just couldn't afford it. And then the other area that I looked at that we talked about because I asked was green and social prescribing. And again, this kind of came up from this sort of background reading, etc. And really the kind of desire for more practical support with the issues that were actually causing their distress and problems. And there were basically the response to it was very positive. And there were sort of three things that really appealed. There was, with the green prescribing, just being in nature. Some of the women talked about how they found that very therapeutic, and it really helped with kind of opening up, etc. Then there was the peer support aspect of it, if it could be combined with peer support, again, coming back to the fact that a lot of them felt quite isolated postnatally. And then there was the practical side of social prescribing, because social prescribing is not, the whole point is it's meant to be sort of tailored to individual needs. And a couple of participants mentioned they'd heard about doula systems, doula programs being enacted. Also, I was talking to somebody who said that there's an antenatal clinic they heard of where they've got somebody from Citizens Advice who will just attend and will offer to give women help with financial advice and support, because there's a lot of, we know there's a lot of benefits that go unclaimed because women don't know how to claim them. So it's, again, it's looking at, you know, the potential for maybe exploring these interventions to try and address those kind of practical concerns that women were raising. And then in terms of factors that could impact cardiovascular health promotion, no surprise, timing, knowledge gaps. None of the women were aware until they found out about my study that cardiovascular risks even were an issue in the future. Finances, several of these women relied on food banks. The one that I talked about earlier, who was discharged to a hotel, she was seen by a dietitian after, who advised her to cut down on her carbs and eat more fruit and vegetables. But she said, you know, she relies on food banks. What you get is pasta and rice. You can't, you know, you don't have control of your diet in those circumstances. And then carrying domestic and work responsibilities, which were just enormous. And several of the women, even if they were in relationships, talked about the fact that they predominantly were responsible for that. One woman said, I don't look after myself. That's silly talk. That's crazy talk, because there's no time for that. And then other things like family factors. So children's food preferences dictated their diets, service gaps. A lot of these women had no access to home blood pressure monitoring in the postnatal period. And then things like language barriers. So jumping ahead. So basically, in terms of implications for research and practice, I think the findings show that current clinical guidelines don't reflect lived realities and women's priorities. If you look at the NICE guidelines, they're very much focused on clinical outcomes. They treat these sort of wider determinants of health as risk factors, but don't actually address them at an individual level. So I think there is sort of real scope for taking a more holistic approach to this, and looking at how we can maybe address the impacts of wider determinants, structural determinants at an individual level. At the same time, calling out what needs to be done at these sort of meso and macro levels as well to address them. I mentioned significant care and information gaps, taking a systems approach, looking at developing novel interventions that are tailored to individual needs. Also, interdisciplinary collaboration. I've been talking to, sort of joined a network of other researchers looking at perinatal mental health and post-diabetes and pregnancy care, looking at how you can reduce longer-term cardiovascular risks. And essentially, we've all kind of, our findings are really similar, and they came to the green and social prescribing aspect as well with their work. And it really came from the women. So we were saying, yet we still seem to be working in these silos. So there is, again, sort of scope for looking at how we could maybe sort of join efforts to address these things together. And then last year, I gave a talk on environmental hazards. So the research showing that things like air pollution, extreme heat, toxic metals are associated with cardiovascular disease risk and hypertension in pregnancy, currently totally overlooked in the guidance. I did explore some of this with the women. I don't have time to talk about it today, but again, that's another blind spot, which I think needs kind of addressing. And then, like I said, addressing the upstream causes. And then I'll just end on a happy note. The findings really showed that kind of empathy and really small acts of kindness went a huge way. So that woman that I mentioned who was discharged to the hotel, her circumstances were really dire. But one of the things she really wanted to talk about was just how much she appreciated the fact that one doctor and a midwife in particular, she had nothing for the baby, went and bought her things for the baby, just little clothes and nappies and that. She was so appreciative. And it really bothered her that she'd sent them cards later and she doesn't know if they got them because she couldn't remember their names. And I think it's a nice kind of reminder that when you're kind of faced with these overwhelming circumstances sometimes that actually can feel a bit, like, gosh, how do we deal with this? It is good to be reminded that actually, just those little kindnesses made a massive difference to the participants that I talked to. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'll leave it there.
Layla, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk and a reminder of how much the woman really must be the centre of everything that we do, and that her life doesn't finish with the end of the pregnancy, it starts.